In this series, video series on the laureates of this edition 2021 of the Global Ethics and Trust in Finance for a Sustainable Future Prize, it is my pleasure to introduce Martin Lockman, who is second prize ex aequo, and that is to the quality of these essays that we have 2 ex aequo prizes. We just couldn't choose as a jury. We had enormous difficulties getting to this small group of laureates. I'm Josina Kamerling. I'm head of regulatory outreach for the CFA Institute, but also co-president of the jury together with Paul Dambinski. Martin, you come from the US, and looking at your paper, lenders as monitors of risk devolution. This is a key issue that is probably not enough discussed as we launch ourselves on the sustainability journey, which is so sexy, but lenders have a real responsibility. When you looked at choosing a topic, what motivated you to discuss this issue?
Thanks so much for speaking to me today. And yes, so when this topic was absolutely motivated by the pandemic. I mentioned it in the introduction to my paper, but there was a moment when I had to drive across the city that had been completely shuttered by COVID. And I hailed a cab, and talking to the driver and looking out in the streets, you could see dozens and dozens of Uber and Lyft drivers driving through the city completely without passengers. And talking to the driver, I realized that that driver was part of a broader picture. So many people have been caught up in this broader restructuring of the labor market, and broader than the labor market, but a restructuring of the way that companies do business and the way that companies handle external contracts, and had taken on enormous amounts of risk that was invisible in good times, but in circumstances like COVID became all too real for the people who had contracted into that risk. So it was absolutely inspired by the pandemic. And looking into it and looking into my work as a finance attorney in New York at the time, I realized that lenders did a lot of work monitoring risk devolution in other circumstances. For instance, in companies that have one major client, lenders will always be looking at the contract with that client to make sure that it's not something that would be sacrificed in the event of a crisis. But I realized that the global gig economy and the way that businesses have outsourced a lot of their work that they would previously do internally has resulted in situations where you have just as much risk from the devolution of volatility to employees and smallholders as you do in the client contract setting.
I think it's very interesting, and your observations, your personal observations from the COVID pandemic did strike me enormously when I read your essay. I'm going to ask you a question about, is what is happening on risk devolution, is that more visible in the US? Because of course the US is a land of great opportunities, but also you can fall quite seriously. It's not like Europe, where perhaps the prosperity is more limited because we have a very strong social model. What is your experience on that? Do you think this is valid, or is this really a global issue?
So I think it really is a global issue. I will say that secondary systems and regulatory systems, things like social safety nets, can mitigate a lot of the impact of this risk emerging as it affects like an individual person. If there is a food safety net system, people won't go hungry if they're unemployed, for instance, or if there is regulation of the types of contracts that can be entered into, maybe risk will be shifted to some people or others. But this is really something that you can see globally. In my paper, I actually talk about not employees, but smallholders. The idea being that this is either a person who is selling their own labor or selling some thinly capitalized asset that's hard to diversify. The classic circumstance that happens really globally is contract farming, where an individual farmer will have a very tightly monitored contract with some food processor or some middleman. And they take on a lot of risk. They take on risk of, for instance, soil erosion, environmental risks, not just volatility, but things that are very difficult for an individual farmer to monitor without access to significant scientific expertise, but where they absolutely absorb those costs over the long term. So governments and different regulatory systems result in risks being passed to different people. But the fact is that smart financiers and smart lawyers can almost always work around those risks and set up circumstances where those risks are pushed to third parties. So the ethical concern is still there. And if there's if what you're relying on is not a restraint on the type of contracting, but you're relying on a restraint on, or you're relying on social safety nets, you still have the ethical issue because those costs, instead of being absorbed by equity, are pushed onto society as a whole. So there's still an ethical concern for lenders, even if it's not as dramatic as somebody starving to death because they lose their job.
No, and that's absolutely true. The ethical concerns do remain. And you highlight some of the issues for regulators and policymakers. What would be your own recommendations for strengthening the financial system and discouraging this unfair allocation of risk?
Yes, so I kind of frame my recommendations in 3 tranches. There's the recommendation at the regulatory level, the recommendation at the institutional level, and at the individual level. And the reason that I argue that lenders are good monitors of this is not because I think that the ideal social circumstance is relying on capital to monitor devolution of risk to employees or devolution of risk to small contractors. It's because this is something that can be done tomorrow. An individual finance practitioner who's negotiating a contract can say to their clients, hey, this is something that we should be concerned about. And they can point to things that are happening in the market right now as evidence of the real risks that this devolution poses. The fact is that companies who shifted risks to employees during the pandemic or to their counterparties are now really struggling in circumstances where the global supply chain is stressed and where employees across the globe have a lot more leverage than they had previously. So any individual practitioner can look at this paper and then turn around and make these arguments to their clients, and I hope they can make them in a convincing way. This is also something that institutions can implement. And I think that, you know, an institution doing it would do it in the same way that an individual would. They point to the risk, they point to the, you know, they might bring up the ethical issues as well, but I think they can convincingly argue to their clients that it's in their interest to start considering these risk devolutions. However, you know, there's a misalignment between capital and human rights here, because ultimately any contractual obligation is something that can be negotiated around. And if you're relying on this kind of natural alignment of interests between smallholders and lenders, based around the idea that those smallholder contracts are valuable to the lenders and valuable to the enterprise, you know, they're not infinitely valuable. And there's a point at which it makes sense for the lenders to devolve risks to smallholders as well. So at that stage, you really do need some regulatory intervention. This is something where, frankly, it's a hard issue to regulate because, again, smart financiers, smart lawyers will be able to work around almost anything that has very strict standards. So I think this is actually a situation where you would look towards regulatory ambiguity, perhaps. You set standards that are not very clearly delineated, but instead governments set standards of reasonableness. They set standards that monitor the processes of risk devolution rather than mandating specific types of contracts. But the core argument of my paper is targeted towards lenders because I think this is something that an individual practitioner can take and implement tomorrow.
And I think, you know, we saw the interest of Commissioner Mairead McGuinness, who's a commissioner for the Director General of Financial Services for the EU Commission, who participated in the award ceremony, and the time she took to really refer to each of your essays. And I think social inclusion, making sure that what is happening in the finance industry and also with this whole sustainability revolution, that it doesn't affect those people who will suffer the most, or the most fragile of the economy, is a key concern. And I think this is very encouraging. So thank you very much for highlighting this. It was a really interesting essay to read. And I welcome you to the alumni world, and I encourage you to stay in contact. And certainly from our side, we will keep watching and discussing with you. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure meeting everybody, and I look forward to reading all of the papers.